All right, so let's get started. Welcome back to the Center for Computational Brain Science Theory. Super excited to have Anne Collins back here. So Anne did her PhD at École Normale Supérieure with Etienne Keklin in Paris, working on computational models of structural learning in prefrontal cortex. And I still say to this day that the best scientific decision I ever made was to hire Anne as a postdoc because she had 0 papers at the time, but we had such an obvious interactive overlapping ideas, and she exuded a lot of brilliance that I was sure that she would do a lot of great things. And for that, I can just say that I was right, but it's all due to her. We did lots of fun things together as a postdoc, and then since then she went to Berkeley, where she was an assistant professor and got tenure a couple of years ago, doing a lot of work on structural learning, computational models at multiple levels of description, on learning and decision-making. She also has made a lot of impact on the methods by which we actually apply computational models and test them, rather just doing it in a knee-jerk way and getting some Greek letters out of our models. She has a recipe of a set of methods that one should apply in order to do it properly and to know when you're not doing it in the right way. I could go on for a while. She won the Young Investigator Award from Cognitive Neuroscience Society, but I think you'd be a lot better just to listen to what she has to say. So today, Ed is going to talk about the importance of goals in human reinforcement learning.
Thank you very much for having me. It's like a delight to be back at Brown. I've been back to Providence since I left, but not, in a professional manner. So it's really great to see so many faces I know. So thank you for having me. Thank you for organizing my call. And today I'm going to talk about some recent work on trying to understand how goals, what role goals play in reinforcement learning, and this is kind of ongoing work. So I'm not going to give you like a finished story by any means, but I hope that at the end I will convince you that of a couple of things. One, that we need to go a bit beyond the classic dual systems kind of approaches, and the other one that we should really consider intrinsic goals when we study decision making in general. Okay, so when we study reinforcement learning, we often don't think too much about rewards and motivation. We tend to take them for granted. So those are my daughters, number 2 and 3. They actually have a name, Sophie and Noemi. Yeah, I don't call them 2 and 3, but and like we think of reinforcers as something that makes you want to do it again, right? And in this case, chocolate, ice cream, cookies, those are like pretty solid reinforcers. The first time Noemi tried ice cream, like she learned that word pretty quickly and learned to ask for it again, right? And so that's kind of standard reinforcers. We also consider more secondary reinforcers. And we try to understand how people learn, or humans and non-human animals learn how to make this kind of choices. And traditionally, people have considered a lot dual systems approaches, which you could summarize in multiple ways. One of which is to say that we have this like fast, old, value-based, more free, habit-like kind of system that is based on cache values that you could summarize like Sophie having just a value that says like chocolate is good. I will go for chocolate. As opposed to another system that is much slower, much more recent evolutionarily, much more cognitive or high level, sometimes called planning or model-based, that considers how our environment changes, or map of the environment, and how we can use that to like go for specific goals. So for example, Sophie decided one day that she wanted the purple to pick up. Yeah.
Apparently people can't hear you back and the microphone isn't working, so you
okay.
try to speak up.
Sounds good. Can you raise your hands when you don't hear me, okay?
Try to shout it.
Okay. Sophie likes the purple to pick up. You can hear it? Yes, okay, good. So she actually you know, like the purple sippy cup has no extrinsic value in and of itself, right? It's just a purple sippy cup out of all the sippy cups or glasses she could drink from. But one day she decided that was the outcome she was going for. And she made the various plans she needed to make to reach that, including stepping on her sister's feet and pulling her hair and stuff like that, right? And that was more like planning. You couldn't expect that there was an extrinsic value to it. But where I'm going to start saying that actually there's not such a clear-cut division between this is that since then, Sophie has acquired a high value for the purple sippy cup itself. Even when she doesn't really want it, she has this like reflexive want for grabbing the purple sippy cup, and it's the one that has high value now. Okay, and it seems like she's developed this cached value for the purple sippy cup despite it not really having any extrinsic value for it. And so what I'll try to convince you today is that maybe the way when we set goals, that has an impact on us creating intrinsic value for them that leads to reinforcing choices that lead to those goals, even in the absence of extrinsic value. I have two parts to my talk, and as I told Michael, there's a long part and a short part, and depending on how slow we go, we can cut the second part out completely. I'm very happy to take questions as I go, and it's really no problem if we don't go through the second part. So please ask questions as you go. Okay, so in the first part, I'll try to convince you of the importance of goals as intrinsic rewards with two different studies. Showing how they matter in the context of learning. And in the second part, if we get to it, I'll try to broaden this to show that goals constrain much of what we think of as model-free reinforcement learning. Okay, so I take the approach of reinforcement learning, which I probably don't need to get into explaining the basics of here, but I'll still set up a little bit the words. So in the context of reinforcement learning, we often consider an agent that is in a given state, makes a choice through some algorithm that is currently just a black box here, obtain some kind of outcome that is the reinforcement that modulates this choice policy between the state and the choice. For much of my talk, I'll use essentially the simplest type of reinforcement learning you can think of, which is this equation here where you update the value of a state and an action in proportion to the reward prediction error, which is the difference between the reward and the value. And the question I'm interested in here is it trivial what this R is? Okay, how do we set this R value? And if you're an did I make a joke? Yeah, okay. If you're a computer scientist doing reinforcement learning model, you'll say, well, the goal of the agent is to reach this corner of the maze. I'm going to define my reward function as a function of this goal. So I'm going to put 10 points or 1,000 points here and 0 elsewhere. And by that, we're going to say that the goal equals the reward in a sense. But what I want to convince you of today is that as far as biological agents are concerned, it's much less trivial than this. It's much less trivial than this because the brain has to interpret any outcome as whether it is subjectively rewarding or not, and not just rewarding, but reinforcing. Okay, so people have studied rewards for a long time and studied what reinforces choices for a long time. And so beyond the primary rewards like cookies and ice cream that we've talked about before, it's widely recognized that there's a wide range of signals that serve as reinforcers, going from very unconditioned ones, primary reinforcers, all the way through more conditioned ones, going through things like beauty or more abstract things like money, tokens, etc. Okay. What is also well known, especially in the social psychology literature, is that people work for goals. So For example, people might have a goal of running a marathon and expend a lot of effort and energy towards reaching that goal in a way that makes us think that there is, some value to be traded between reaching a different goal and working for it. Instead, there's this really fun finding about really exemplifying this in this paper here, where you see the curve of running times for marathon aggregated over many years, and it has this really fascinating shape where you would expect probably like something really smooth, but when you look at the like 4-hour mark or 4.5-hour mark, you have those like deviation from the expected distribution that really show you that this very arbitrary goal of being under 4 hours or under 4.5 hours like gives you this push to like exert extra effort in a way that is really not very logical if you are just considering overall value, etc. Okay, so people exert effort, exchange money, take pains and costs to reach goals that are very arbitrary, including finishing puzzles, like doing a Rubik's Cube or something like that, with very unclear reasons underneath it. And maybe that there are possible many possible explanations, but the one I want to focus on today is the fact that when we set goals, maybe we somehow set in our brain a reward value for those goals that then serves not only as evaluation for the outcome, but as a reinforcer of the choices that came before it. And there are people in this room who have studied similar kind of questions, obviously more in the domain of decision making. So today I want to focus on this reinforcement aspect in the context of reinforcement learning. So I'll tell you about a couple studies we've done on this. One is meant as a proof of concept that really goals can explain phenomena that have been explained in other ways before, and maybe explain them in a more compelling way. And second, digging into the mechanisms for which this happens. Okay, so in the first part, I want to talk about context dependence in reward-based learning. So context-sensitive valuation is this phenomenon where the subjective value of an outcome is dependent on the context. So consider, Sophie getting ice cream, and she likes chocolate ice cream, maybe at a 0.7 value or something like that. She goes to an ice cream shop and there's vanilla and chocolate on display. She picks chocolate, she's happy. Right after, the merchant pulls out another flavor of ice cream that she likes even more. What do you think Sophie is feeling now? Like she's feeling really disappointed, right? Even though the value itself, extrinsic value, hasn't changed. The subjective interpretation of this value has changed. Okay, so this is the broad phenomenon of context-sensitive valuation, which has been shown in the context of decision making, also in the context of learning, with this kind of paradigms where participants learn to pick between two items, for example, item A and B here, where item A leads to 1 point probabilistically and 0 otherwise, and B is the reverse, so it's the bad option. Okay, so if you consider someone learning this, then learning about the pair CD, which leads to 0 versus -1 with probability 80%, and C is the best item on the pair here, people are going to be able to learn this very well, to pick A and to pick C. Okay, now if you put participants in a follow-up test phase where they have to pick between B and C, the rational, economically rational decision to make is to pick B, right? Because B has an expected value of 0.2 and C has an expected value of -0.2, right? But what people instead very reliably do is pick C. So this is from a paper with Michael in 2012, where we called it like picking the frequent loss avoider option, which is C here, around 70% of the time. This has been replicated multiple times since. Also, not just in the domains of gains and losses, because that could be a little bit special, just with different outcome values. For example, here A leads to 10 points, C leads to 1 point with 80% probability. Again, participants should pick B because B has expected value of 2 versus C has expected value of 0.8, but instead participants pick C very reliably. Okay, so this is thought of as in the context of context valuation, and in particular, Sophie Bavard and Stefano Palminteri did a lot of experiments with this, where they replicated this finding many times. It looks like this in their experiments. The context 7 here is essentially capturing this, this kind of B versus C situation, and they're showing that participants are below chains at picking B over C in this experiment in over 800 participants. Okay, so they explain this with a model that's called range adaptation. So range adaptation is a model that's inspired from vision models, where we know that how you perceive the size of something, for example, is dependent on the size of things around it. So they say, well, maybe this principle applies also to things like reinforcement, where we don't perceive reward just in a purely extrinsic way, but we renormalize it based on the range we're working with. Okay, so my experience reward is going to be renormalized by the minimum possible value divided by the maximum minus the minimum. Okay, and so if you do the math here, like here 0.7 is going to be the maximum, so the felt value is going to be 0.1, but here 0.7 is not the maximum, so the felt value is going to be lower, which is going to be able to account for the type of phenomena that we showed before. Instead, what we're proposing is a slightly different interpretation, where the felt reward is instead going to be a mixture of the true reward value and an intrinsic reward value, which is going to be just, did you reach your goal or not? And if you reach your goal, here in the simplistic case, we're defining this as, did you get the maximum obtainable value or not? Okay, so this is just a simplistic model of reaching your goal. We're not claiming that's always the case, but it's the simplest you can think of in this case. Okay, and so our intrinsically enhanced model says, well, the subjective reward value that's going to serve as the reinforcer is going to be a mixture of this true reward and the intrinsic reward. Okay, and so again, if you do the math here, you're going to be mixing 0.7 with 1 on the left because you got your goal, but with 0 on the right because you did not get the goal of getting the max, which is going to make it feel worse. Okay, so the first thing we did was to test this model on the publicly available data from Sophie Bavard and Stefano Palminteri. They had 8 data sets on this experiment, which is exactly the type of experiment I showed you before. So you have some outcomes, probabilistic outcomes that lead to either 10 points or 1 point with probability 75-25. Participants learn the pairs independently of each other, and then in a test phase, they get recombined. And the key comparison is this comparison here between an item that has 2.5 expected value, but was the worst option of its pair, and an item that has 0.75 expected value, but was the best option of its pair. Okay, so if you're following economic rules, you should be picking this one, but participants pick this one very reliably across many different ways in which they could be learning this. Those are the 8 groups of participants that learned this experiment in various ways. You don't really need the details about this. What you need to see just is that this context 7 here is always below chains. And both the range model, which is in teal here, and the intrinsically enhanced model can capture the pattern of behavior very well across all contexts after having been fit to the data. Here I'm plotting the overall responsibility across the group of the 2 models, and you see that they're both doing really well. We had the hybrid actor-critic model that I developed for that original paper that is also doing fine in this case. Okay, so far it's just a proof of concept. Okay, the range model is doing fine, the actor-critic model is doing fine, the intrinsically enhanced model is doing fine, and can capture this data, and we replicated this in 3 other published data sets. But of course, both models make similar qualitative predictions here. So we can't really, we can say like, okay, it's a reasonable hypothesis for this, but it's not, is it actually, what's happening? So we designed a new experiment to try to test the competing predictions. And this was an experiment, again, modified from Bavar and Parliamentary's setup to try to pull them apart. We registered this, replicated, and did a control experiment. That all led to the same conclusion. So I'm just showing one of them. Okay, so here's the experiment. So instead of having pairs, this time we had triplets of options that were three shapes like this. Again, participants picked one of them and saw an outcome. The outcome was continuous this time. The positioning on the screen was randomized across trials. There were two triplets. And in each triplet, there was a low option, a medium option, and a high option with a fairly tight distribution around them. So it wasn't too hard to learn. Okay. In some trials, participants only saw two items out of the pair. For example, the low and the high option here in both contexts. And the key manipulation is that in some trials, they saw only two items. For the first pair, they saw the low paired with the medium option. And for the other pair, they saw the medium paired with the high option. Okay, and the idea of why this is going to pull apart the two hypotheses here is that the medium option here is going to be the best of the two options regularly, which should boost its intrinsic value as having reached the goal, whereas here it's going to be the worst option, so should make the prediction that it's less valued overall. Whereas the range model predicts no difference because the range is always the same. Okay, so our core prediction is that participants should exhibit some form of better learning for M1 as opposed to M2, and that can be revealed in multiple ways in the behavior. So we did a test phase where we repaired all items together and tested which one they picked. And indeed, we found that participants picked the high more than the medium than the low, but were more likely to pick M1 than M2 overall. And if you plot the difference between those two bars here, you see that it's a very strong, significant effect that our model can capture quite well, but the range model cannot capture. We also had participants rate just how much they liked the 6 items. And we saw the same effect here, where M1 was rated higher compared to M2. Again, this is the difference here in rating. And we fit the models to the data, and again found a much stronger effect for intrinsically, much better fit for intrinsically enhanced model compared to a range model. Okay, so the take-home message for this part is that intrinsically enhanced class of reinforcement learning models is a possible computational account for context-sensitive reinforcement learning. It assumes that reaching a goal is rewarding intrinsically in a way that is comparable on the same scale as more classic rewards, above and beyond the extrinsic outcome value. So the next question we had was, yes?
Absolutely. So if we consider the fact that literature
yeah.
How is the fact that we know that people are kind of sensitive to race, how does that incorporate into this reward evaluations? We talk about the next reward, so that we have already adjusted for the potential risk. Because what I could see is that the difference between the purple and the blue could be driven by the fact that in one of the contexts, people are just less exposed to selecting the more risky option.
Yeah. So here, because it's overall values, not probabilities, so they get a reward each time. So it's 100% value. So it's hard to see exactly how the prospect theory aspect of probabilities will have an impact. It is very possible that the prospect theory component of like downweighing higher values could have an impact. And in fact, if you look at that tiny font here. This is actually not the original range model. This is the range to the Z model, which Bavar and Parliamentary did exactly to incorporate this kind of worries. So the Z is a power exponent on the extrinsic outcome value that takes into account this potential nonlinear shape of reward outcome as into subjective values. So it takes that into account. For the other experiments in which there are probabilities, it's possible, but because this is learning, participants learn those cache values, right? And so you'd have to somehow think about how, why people would like explicitly evaluate probabilities and then pass them through some kind of nonlinearities of prospect theory rather than just like doing this cache value. But I do think there's a link in the sense that I think people have proposed somewhat similar theory for explaining prospect theory instead, for saying like, well, maybe, the reason you're risk averse is that you put some value on having the maximum or, like some kind of goal or some kind of threshold value of outcome. And that is what is being seen in those, like subjective, descriptive values of risk aversion. So I think there's a link potentially, but I would maybe put it as an explanatory link rather than in the opposite direction. Does that make sense? Thanks for the question. Happy to take any questions. Okay, so the question we had then was like, okay, well, if goals potentially are taken from this extrinsically neutral outcome signal and translated into something that the brain can interpret as a reinforcement, through what mechanism could this potentially happen? How does the brain translate context-dependent goals into a reward scale? So we want to ask the question, can we put at the very end of this, rainbow of types of more and more cognitive outcomes, completely novel arbitrary goals that have no extrinsic value, and see whether the same reward systems that react to more standard kind of goals will also react to that. Okay, so we wanted to take the same approach that people have done in the past to try to look at this. So people have compared, primary reinforcers to secondary reinforcers to more abstract reinforcers. But something that hasn't been done is look at this in a way that is really on the fly, context dependent. And I want to convince you really that that's not trivial. So I'm going to appeal to your scientific brain. You guys probably will do data analysis and plot things like this in your everyday life. And when you see this plot, right now it's probably fairly neutral for you guys, unless you have strong aesthetic preferences about my plotting not looking nice, but it's not valuable in and of itself, right? It's like pretty neutral. Now, imagine your goal was to say that variables A and B are independent, right? Like now, immediately this is valuable, right? This like is pretty satisfying, feels like a win. By contrast, if you had done this plot, you would have been a bit less happy, probably, okay? Now, if your goal had been to show that variable A is a predictor of variable B, the opposite would be true. Okay, so the very same neutral outcome can be interpreted as rewarding or unrewarding on the fly, really dependent on your goal. Okay, and the question is, does that recruit the same systems in the brain, and does that feedback into reinforcing whatever you did to obtain this plot? Okay, so what about one-shot on the fly kind of goals? So to test this, we went back to the probabilistic reinforcement learning task, which everyone knows here, where you pick between two items and get 1 point or 0 in a probabilistic way. We added randomly interleaved with pairs that led to rewards, separate pairs that led to novel goals. Okay, so it works this way. Before the start of the trial, you'll see two fractals two novel fractals, one of which is labeled as your goal and one of which is labeled as a non-goal. Okay. And then you make your choice, for example, the star. And in this case, you pick the star and you obtained the goal fractal. Okay. And the next time you see the star and the triangle, the goals fractals will be completely different. Okay. So you have to do this completely on the fly. Okay. You have to say, I want to pick, I pick the star. And the question we ask is, does getting this brand new goal that we've just discovered reinforce your choices and feel rewarding in the same way that getting something condition like a +1 or 0, something that is frequently interpreted as reward versus not, does. Okay, so we had 4 pairs of items, 2 of which were point condition, 2 of which were goal condition, and in both cases we had an easy and a hard condition where the probabilities were different. Any questions on the experimental design? This is randomly interleaved. Yes.
Is there a financial reason why they would have their goal versus the not goal?
No. So we tracked participants' points. They had a counter on the screen, and they were told to try to maximize their points. There was no incentive whatsoever on the goal condition. And so we did tell them to try to reach their goal, but that was the extent of it. Yeah. Thank you for the question. Yeah.
Does in the second case, does the star always, or that probability lead to the goal fractal regardless of what the goal fractal is? Or is it just if they're random?
Yeah, I should fix my slide. There should be a star here instead of a square, really. Yes, so if you pick the star, it will always lead to the goal image, but the goal image will always be, well, not always, 77% of the time, but the goal image will be new each time. Any other questions? Thank you. I need to fix that slide. Okay, we had 2 runs of this. It was in the scanner, and in between there was an and back task to measure working memory performance. Okay, so first participants were able to learn this pretty well. This is overall proportion of correct choices, correct defined as picking the option in the pair that leads to points or to goals more likely. We had a main effect of difficulty, which is completely expected. We also had a main effect of condition. So the goals were learned slightly less well than the rewards, but very significantly above chains. So there was a good learning from goals, but was somewhat impaired compared to rewards. We looked at reaction times to see, as a first pass, to try to see if different processes were involved. We had this reasoning that it was possible that people would behave in what people think of goal-directed way. So, for example, learning the transition probabilities rather than the values, and try to plan ahead, like, okay, I'm going to pick the star because it's likely to lead to the, goal category image. If that had been the case, we would have expected slower overall reaction times. That's not what we find. We find no main effect of reaction times, of condition on reaction times. We do find a main effect of difficulty on reaction times and no interactions. Okay, so it looks like the manipulation around the goals is not making the task so much harder, that it creates a dual task effect or something driving difficulty in a way that is reflecting in reaction times. We found a selective correlation between working memory performance and performance in the goal condition, such that people with better executive function seem to learn better from the goals compared to rewards. Okay, so next we try to understand how this happens. So for us, this was in the first pass showing that there doesn't seem to be an obviously different decision-making process happening here, but somehow there is still potentially a dependence on executive function that is leading to this deficit in overall learning. We captured this with a simple reinforcement learning model, same as before, which we fit using Parham-Perez hierarchical Bayesian inference task. This fit captured the participants' learning curve quite well. And the best fitting model was a model in which there were different learning rates for the reward versus goal condition. Importantly, a model with different noise parameters did not fit better, so that we could rule out the idea that participants were just overall worse just due to making noisier choices due to having to maintain goals. Instead, it looks like the worst performance was captured by slower learning overall, which we thought potentially could be due to lapses in encoding goals. We'll get back to that. Okay, so participants were in the scanner. So we tried to see how to get at the mechanisms supporting learning in the goal condition. We found evidence for recruitment of the control network. So for example, at the time prior to the choice, when participants need to encode the goal versus non-goal condition, there was activation in the control network, parietal and lateral prefrontal cortex here. This was not sustained during the choice period, but then was evident again at the time of outcome, where a lateral prefrontal cortex was recruited again. Okay, so there was selective involvement of executive functions in the goal condition. Next, we tried to look at the reward network instead. And so to do this, we used the familiar condition as localizer for this. So we used trials in the familiar condition to try to identify regions sensitive to classic markers of reinforcement learning in the brain. And then we use those regions of interest to look into the goal condition, so independent trials, to see if the same variables were also encoded in this condition. Okay, so we found fairly classic regions of interest, encoding valence, expected value, and reward prediction errors. And when we looked in those ROIs into the goal trials, we found that those regions of interest also encoded the same variables for the goal condition trials, with this little hiccup here in the striatum that we actually where we actually showed that we could decode reward prediction errors from a model trained on the reward condition in the goal condition. Okay, so this convinced us that canonical reward regions of interest also seem to encode corresponding one-shot goal reinforcement learning signals, supporting our hypothesis that the goals subjective intrinsic outcomes seem to be integrated into the computational values the same way that rewards are. We have since done this study in EEG2 and found very supporting results there. So for example, we find a very similar feedback-related negativity signals in the points and goals condition. And we can also decode outcome from the EEG signal by training it on the points condition and decoding it in the goal condition in EEG. However, we also see differences. For example, the P300 signal is very different in the goal and reward condition, giving us further hints of involvement of executive functions in this goal condition. Okay, so we next try to understand, so we at this point we are somewhat convinced that the reward circuit is being recruited in the same way, but there are also other processes that are recruited. And to try to explain this, we try to take the approach of there is an impairment here, and maybe like if we can deconstruct where this impairment comes from, we'll be able to get a handle on the mechanisms that are allowing us to translate goals into rewards. Okay, so we have some hints that executive functions are involved. So we're going to test three potential hypotheses for how this might be. So the first hypothesis we had was that there might just be simple lapses in encoding goals. Okay, so if you are encoding like those two fractals, novel fractals, you're told this is a goal, this is a non-goal, and then you see an outcome later. If you haven't encoded it well at the first, or if you're not retrieving well at the end, then this outcome will not be interpretable in a way that could be impact something that looks like cloning. Okay, so that was our simplest first hypothesis. Another hypothesis is that we are putting memory load on participants who are holding items in memory, although it's very light, right? It's just like one item. Maybe it's a single delay match to sample kind of load, but maybe that impairs either decision making or creative assignment or something like that. Our third hypothesis was just that somehow the appetitive signal for goals is weaker than for points for reasons that we would need to further elucidate. Okay, so let's try to test those three hypotheses with the data we have. For the first one, we started by looking into the scanner again with the same data set, and we said, well, if it's a matter of encoding goals in and occasionally that lapses and that leads to weaker signals, we should expect that we could see this at the single trial level by seeing weaker executive function kind of signaling here, leading to weaker decoding or identification of outcome signals here at the time of feedback. Okay, so we did this kind of connectivity correlational analysis between regions. We took as a seed the prefrontal region that we had identified as being relevant in this task. And then we tried to see with the various reward ROIs whether there was signs of stronger connectivity in the goal condition. And so I'm highlighting just two of those regions here, but that's indeed what we found. We found stronger connectivity in the goal region compared to the reward region. In a way that was related to individual differences in behavior. Okay, so this is like a hint that potentially there is a role in how much executive functions are involved at the time of encoding the goals. We also found stronger P3 in EEG for the goal condition compared to reward. But we're still trying to interpret this because it's conflicting with other findings. So we're not quite sure exactly what's happening here actually. So we tried to test more directly the idea that this might be related to lapses in goal encoding. So to do that, we developed a new experiment where we took the same idea of having both points and goals condition, but instead of having this probabilistic selection task underneath it, we had a stimulus action learning task underneath it that's inspired by my reinforcement learning and working memory task. Okay, so participants learned 6 stimulus action associations. They had 3 choices. The outcomes were deterministic in this case. Okay, so if you pick the pumpkin, saw the pumpkin, selected press with your index finger, and got a goal, and this time you would always get a goal image for selecting the pumpkin. And same for the points condition. The reason we moved to this task is that we found it very hard to model the probabilistic selection task in a way that was reliable at the individual participant level, and we found much better resolution of the computational modeling with this task instead. Okay, so we had the conditions were blocked this time, so there were some blocks that were goal blocks and some blocks that were points blocks. In different blocks, participants learned completely new stimulus action associations. Good? Okay, great. Okay, so what did we find? Well, first we, oh, and I forgot the most important thing we changed was that we also had participants signal whether they got a goal or not. Okay, so we had participants press the space bar to collect good outcomes, and that included +1s or goals. Okay, and that was a way for us to directly test this lapse kind of question, because that way we could, see what they interpreted as being rewarded versus non-rewarded. Of course, with a bit of noise potentially, but still better than guessing. Okay, so first we replicated the findings. So these are the learning curves as a function of the number of times that participants have encountered a given stimulus. You see a very, very strong effect of points versus goals. The dots here are individual participants, so you see that nearly everyone shows this effect here. So it's much more robust than the probabilistic learning task we had before, which helps a lot with modeling. Okay. next we looked at the reward collection, and to do that, we compute the D prime here in reward collection. And there's two things to note here. One is that the D prime is very high in both conditions, meaning that participants are very, very good at encoding, at grabbing the points, but they're also very, very good at encoding the goals and recognizing them. Okay, but there is also a strong effect between conditions. So far, it's possible that these lapses could potentially explain this. Okay, so if this difference is what explains the difference in learning, then you would expect to see that across individuals, participants who encode goals less well are the ones who have the bigger difference in learning, right? Okay, this is the outcome. Not there at all, okay? No correlation whatsoever between reward collection D prime and overall difference in performance, okay? So we're not, ruling out completely that there might be a role played by lapses in goal collection here, but it doesn't seem like it's the driving mechanism, right? Otherwise, we really should see this correlation coming up. We're also pretty well powered here. Okay, the next thing we did to try to make sure that wasn't the case is that we took the models that worked well to capture the behavior here, replaced the objective outcome of goal versus non-goal with subjective, did I grab it or not kind of outcome, and it did not improve fit at all. Okay, so it just doesn't look like this is what's driving the difference in behavior. Okay, so that's hypothesis A. So hypothesis B was instead that this is some kind of general overload on executive function that drives the difference. Okay, and this is also compatible with the finding of correlation between end-back performance and differences in behavior. So to try to get at this, we attempted to decrease the load on participants. So we did a few things, but one of the things we tried to do is have a second experiment in which instead of having goals change on every single trial, we had goals remain the same throughout the whole block. Okay, with the idea that if they remain the same, there's much less difficulty in encoding them and retrieving them, which should make this, holding them in mind while making choices or learning much less of a dual task component. Okay. So when we do that, we do improve the reward collection. Here you can see that now the reward collection for goals compared to points is indistinguishable in terms of D prime. We do improve performance. So the goals condition is now much closer to the points, but it's still significantly lower. So here you see the overall performance across participants. You see that it's still significantly below points, although weaker than before. Okay, so this looks like it could be part of the explanation. But it's probably not the whole explanation either. There's still no correlation whatsoever between individual differences in reward collection, goal collection, outcome collection, and overall learning performance. Yes?
So here you're just manipulating working memory load, but do you also have working memory capacity measures for the subjects?
Yeah, I do. And we have conflicting results there. In various versions of the task, what we tend to find is that the end-back performance is predictive of behavior, but often not only in the goal condition, also in the points condition, which makes the interaction non-significant, but we're not completely sure if that's if that means that it's not selective, because this is the version of the task where you could also use working memory to solve part of the learning problem. So we're lacking a bit in power there potentially. So it's a bit hard to conclude this one. Yeah. Thank you for the question. Yes.
So I'm struggling to understand why the experiment really talk about subjective because it seems to me that it's still involved by the experiment and what the association is. So is that maybe something that we are surprised now that we don't find differences in the reward collection, even that it might be that it's not really about subjective values.
So I think there's two different points here. So I'm not surprised that there's no difference, but not because of the subjective value question, just because you always see the same item, so it's really easy to like just store this information and keep it going. So I'm not surprised. We have decreased the load. That was the goal of the manipulation. So this is a manipulation check, not a result, right? But the question of about subjective value, I mean, it's imposed in both cases, right? Whether it's novel or not novel, right? So that shouldn't be the driver of the difference between those two versions of the experiment. I do think the question about, the fact that it's imposed by the experimenter is an interesting one, but I'd rather keep for the discussion at the end. But I do think it's an important question, but I don't think I think it's equally, so in all the experiments I've done so far. Other questions? Yes. Hi.
So do you think here the work is being done in the fact that one of them is called going on board or the fact that the differences in how consistent the items are, in that, in one case +1 always versus the other case, the image is changing more frequently.
So are you talking about experiment 2 or experiment 1?
Either one. In both the cases, that's true.
Yeah.
And so is it really the fact that you're calling it a goal that's really making a difference, or the fact that it's inconsistent?
No, I think so. Let's talk about experiment 2 because everything else is matched, right? So I think if I had put goal and non-goal instead of win and lose, I would have the same effect. So maybe I should have done that just to about the difference. And so when you're talking about doing the work, do you talk about the fact that there's still a difference, or yeah,
why there's a difference between the two? Because I mean, at some level they are both very abstract goals.
Yeah, and what I think is different is that this is conditioned, right? And we know of many mechanisms in the brain, like for creating value for things that like you learn are valuable over time. So in that sense, we can say there is a cash value in most of us, like for interpreting points as rewarding, and so that's how we understand secondary reinforcers to work, right? The difference here is that this is novel and arbitrary, and you should not come to the experiment with having a cash value for it, and so you have to assign it on the fly. Yeah.
That makes sense. So I guess this is a counterfactual. If you were to if you were not to actually tell them this is the goal,
yeah,
right? So just to the experiment,
yeah,
where they had moved,
yeah,
per se,
yeah.
it's still done.
I think they'd learn the statistical structure of it, but I don't know what their choices would be like. And actually, we have that planned as a follow-up experiment to take a look at because I think that's an interesting question in terms of the potential predictability of things here. I don't think people would favor one over the other.
So if something tends to match,
Yeah, but it would match in the other case too, right? Like if you pick the wrong action, it would match to the non-goal, right? So they might actually learn in the opposite direction because there's two, like two actions that
non-match. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
So it's interesting to see what happens there. In particular, when you get the reward signals, right?
Yeah, and I think that could be very interesting individual differences there too, potentially, right? Like some people might learn one way and others the opposite. So I agree. That's an open question. Yeah, thank you. Okay, so looks like our hypothesis B that executive functions are playing a more general role that we're not sure exactly what it is certainly part of the story, but probably also not the whole story. So the last hypothesis we tested was that potentially there's just a weaker appetitive signal for goals. So to test this, we had participants rate how much they liked the outcomes, +1 versus 0, but also the various fractals that they saw. Okay, so in experiment 1, there were a lot of fractals, so they rated just a few that were recently seen. In experiment 2, there was just 1 pair, so they were able to rate that well. And what we found was small but significant effect in both cases of liking the points slightly more than the goal. And in experiment 2, where participants saw the fractals multiple times, we were able to ask for multiple ratings. One before the start of the experiment, like that was the very first time they saw those fractals. One right after they saw those fractals, and it was assigned as being the goal versus non-goal for the first time. And one at the very end of the experiment. And we saw this pattern where the difference in liking between the goal versus non-goal image emerged across the experiment. Okay, so this is not particularly novel either. People have shown that, you know, you tend to like something that is your goal more. And so we're finding this here too. It also does not predict individual differences in learning. So again, it seems like maybe, you know, there's something there, but clearly we still haven't cracked, you know, exactly what's happening in this situation. Okay, so like I said, work in progress. Reaching a goal seems to trigger intrinsic rewards that are on a shared scale with extrinsic rewards. The mechanisms supporting this are partly dependent on executive functions, but it remains unclear exactly what they are. We saw that the low non-executive function leads to an impact on learning, but not choice, right? Because the choice process is not noisier, is not slower, so it doesn't seem like it's leading to a different way of making choices. And to occasional lapses in encoding, but that are not fully responsible. It is also clear that abstract novel goals are less intrinsically rewarding than extrinsic rewards. And there's a possibility here that this could be because points are extrinsically rewarding, but also intrinsically rewarding as like reaching your goal, right? So you might be adding this extrinsic part to the extrinsic part that is part of the goal condition. So that might be what we're seeing here. Okay, so I hope I've convinced you that novel arbitrary goals are part of this, you know, rainbow of types of reinforcers. That what a reward or teaching signal is not a trivial question in the context of reinforcement learning, and that considering internal goals is essential to studying learning and decision making. I like to have a slide on why it matters, because I mean, I think it's interesting from an intellectual kind of pursuit point of view, but I also think this is potentially a really important consideration for psychiatric conditions. So I think maladaptive goals treated as reward could potentially lead down learning policies that are goal dependent in a way that goes contrary to more ecologically valid types of rewards. So you can think of conditions like anorexia nervosa, or you know, where excessive exercise becomes highly valued. Something that is extrinsically rewarding, like calories, become the opposite, penalized. You could see that if this starts as a goal setting kind of situation that hijacks the reward system, you could imagine this leading down behaviors that are maladaptive potentially. The other reason I think this matters is that we live in a reward sparse environment, and you know, most of us don't get chocolate ice cream when we make good choices. So you know, if we think that like the reward processes in the brain are an important part of our decision-making processes, then it's likely that there's all the signals that go through that to help us learn and be flexible and adapt to our environment. And so setting goals or sub-goals is probably an important way through which we can leverage this reward circuit for adaptive behavior in more situations, in a way that's maybe consistent with the type of hierarchical reinforcement learning that we've worked on. So sub-goals could be critical components. So understanding their roles as reinforcers, I think, is important. Okay, so in this part of the talk, I've tried to convince you that, reinforcement learning system is not this like separate, old, fast kind of system that does its own little thing on its side, while, or like smug higher level functions do something else on top. Instead, I think that they provide lots of inputs to the system that make it be actually a really smart and a useful system to have in the brain. Michael, how am I doing on time?
12 now, but
Okay.
there's, I mean, after you're done, anybody above the have sandwiches, and I don't think that will take a whole hour. If anybody who needs to leave, they can just leave, and if you want to go on for another short section, that's fine.
Okay, so let me just yeah, okay, so part 2 is short, so maybe I can spend 10 minutes on that. Is that okay?
That's good.
Yeah, or I could just conclude here. That's also fine.
Go on.
Thank you. Okay, so in the second part, I want to broaden this a little bit. So far we've shown that executive functions play a role in reinforcing. And I want to show that executive functions actually control many of the inputs to this reward system. Okay, so I'll skip the part where I show that executive functions contribute by setting policies in themselves. That's work I did with Michael here, and I've extended previously, showing that working memory really play a role in helping us learn. I'll also skip a part where I talk about how executive functions help us define states for reinforcement learning. There's many of the labs that have worked on this, including people here. So I think you guys are familiar with this, so I'm skipping it. I'd like to talk quickly about how executive functions also help us define what the action space is over which maybe reinforcement learning computations operate in the brain. Okay, and this idea here is that you can describe choices at very many, in multiple ways. Okay, you can describe a choice at the lowest kind of level as a motor movement, or as a slightly more abstract a key press, or specific key press like pressing C, for example, or a key combination like Control C. Or slightly more abstract as like, I'm going to copy something, I'm going to make another box, blue box, I'm going to make a figure, and I'm making a presentation. Okay, those are all like valid descriptions of the choices I was making when I was making this slide. And they're just very different abstract levels, and they're temporally aligned, right? It's not about sequences. They're just like, at this point I'm choosing to make I'm making a decision, and I can describe it in all these different ways. Okay. What I like to show is that the way you describe those choices has an impact on the learning processes, and probably the way the brain represents it has an impact on how we learn, and also emphasize why this matters again. Okay, so to do this, we again did a fairly simplistic experiment that is meant as a proof of concept of the role of how we define choices. Okay, so the experiment was again a stimulus action learning task with deterministic feedback, with 6 stimuli, where participants saw a stimulus here, that's a star, and for example, press the middle button, got +1, press right, got 0, press middle, get +1. So it's deterministic feedback. So the control condition, we have another position condition that's exactly the same thing, except there's distractors here that are labels in the 3 boxes that participants are told are not relevant for this block of the experiment. Okay, so they should, if the left key press works for something, they should keep pressing the key press, even if it now has a red label. Okay, in the label condition, the role is reversed of position, and label is reversed. And again, people are instructed about this. So here they need to select the box that has a blue label if they want to be 100% rewarded. That makes sense? Okay, we see this as a higher level kind of choice, right? Because when you pick the blue label, you still have to decide on the motor movement that will let you pick the blue label afterwards. So in this sense, the label condition is hierarchically higher compared to the position. Okay, so when we let participants learn in this task, we see a strong impact of the condition, even though if you were maybe modeling this with a reinforcement learning algorithm, you just treat the 3 choices as 1, 2, 3, the way you always do. So it's not a given that it should be different, but nevertheless we find a strong impact in the label condition. We can isolate part of the cost to learning from labels to credit assignment issues, where participants make very specific types of errors, right? So you can take a look at the types of errors participants do. So for example, if you're making an error in the position condition where you're picking this 3rd box here, you might think that that is because previously the blue label happen to be rewarded, and so maybe you're assigning credit to the wrong type of choice. And reversed in the label condition, if you're picking the left box after the left blue box was rewarded, that might be because you're accidentally reinforcing the wrong action choice, action space. Okay, so we take a look at this type of errors, and we actually find an asymmetry between the 2 conditions, such that in the label condition, we do see this type of attribution errors, but we do not see them in the position condition. Okay, so there seems to be some kind of interference from lower level, but not from higher level kind of choices. And we replicated this in a version of the experiment where we had different set sizes across blocks to try to get at the mechanisms underneath it. And we found that in every set size, there was a lower performance for the label compared to the position condition. And this error attribution was not dependent on set size here. Okay, so it seemed like learning is more incremental. And we had the standard working memory effect here, but also I probably don't need to explain here. So the label effect is present everywhere, but weaker in set size too. So we turned to computational modeling to try to parse this out. We started from a reinforcement learning model that has 2 modules, learning for each type of action state. So either the choice is the label or the choice is the position, and we assume that the policy is a mixture. Here in this experiment, we added the working memory module that's standard work with Michael here, that also had this tracking of either label or position, and we assumed that the policy was a mixture. And what we found was the best fitting model. Yeah, so I'm going quickly, assuming that people know this. Okay. Okay, the winning model was a model in which the working memory contribution was weaker in the label condition compared to the position condition, where again the noise parameters were shared, so showing that the impairment is not due to noisier decision making, and where in both cases there was a significant interference from the wrong action state, so that the mixture here from the wrong action state was significantly non-zero. But only for the label condition and not the position condition. The model captures the behavior really well, including the error types. And the way it captures it is by having weaker working memory contributions. So the conclusion we draw from this is that setting the label choice space seems to be tapping into the shared resource of executive function in the way that decreases its potential contribution to learning from labels. But that nonetheless, this action space is shared across the 2 systems and interfering in both systems. Okay, so I think this is, again, a fairly simple type of evidence that executive function define relevant choices for learning. And this is something, again, we can recast as being interesting in more complex situations where having the definition of a choice space be at the right level of hierarchy is going to be crucial for both exploration and transfer of skills. So that, for example, like if you know that at this time, it's a good idea to copy something, but your keyboard happens to not be working, you can still select copy, but execute it in a different way, potentially. And that value is shared if you represent this action at the abstract level that is appropriate. And similarly, if you know how to copy this blue box using Control-C, then presumably you can apply this skill to copying something else, like the names and affiliations in a different paper. Okay, so, we show this in a very kind of trivial example, but I think it has broad implications for much more interesting aspects of cognition in exploration and generalization. Something that we've explored with Michael in our hierarchical models, where we select a rule, which is kind of the highest level of abstraction of choice in a way that conditions choices below it. Okay, so I hope I've convinced you that executive functions play a role in all aspects of reinforcement learning. And so the take-homes from this talk is that reinforcement learning processes are really not this separate, independent, old, fast, and dumb process, but really that the input is strongly controlled by role-dependent executive functions in a way that enables humans to leverage value computing circuits for more abstract and internally relevant purposes. Model-free reinforcement learning process in that way are really clever in that they can support efficient, flexible, dynamic decision-making by integrating all kinds of relevant inputs. And so I'll put in a plug for my opinion paper on Beyond Simple Dichotomies in Decision-Making that tries to make that case more specifically. So I'd like to thank my lab members, in particular Gaia Molinaro here, who did much of the work that I presented in the first part, also Sam McDougall and Beth, who also worked on the goals and rewards project. And thank you for your attention.
I have a few questions and then
Yep.
people can just keep and chat with Anne in the room.
Sounds good. Yeah.
And thank you for giving me this talk. So I completely agree. I'm very sympathized with the idea that those tendencies are gonna create lots of interesting structures or influence on our life. But what do you think governs these goals?
Yeah.
So in your task, you put a fractal and you say goal.
Yeah.
And so and then the subject is like, okay.
Yeah.
But that's a really different analog to what we do in real.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, maybe I would make a pitch that emotions in particular are very relevant for creating goal spaces that we want to tackle, but I would love to hear your thoughts about like taking to the next level and saying like, what is it that pushes that goal to be something that we prioritize and structure all these types of moral dependencies.
Yeah. Thank you for the question. Yeah, and I think that follows up on the extrinsic, like the fact that we're assigning the goals to participants. So I totally agree that this is, in a sense, a very unecologically valid experiment where we're really assigning goals, which doesn't feel very real, although you can really also think of experiments like of cases in real life where this happens. I think this happens a lot to kids in school, for example, where they're just told what they should strive for and go for it. The reason we do this is very pragmatic. It's that if we let participants pick their goals, then we can't be assured that there isn't extrinsic value that they have learned about them, right? So we really see this as the first step, as saying, well, we really want to see if there is something beyond any extrinsic value that has been learned that is special about goals. And so to do that, we're going to try to remove any extrinsic value and see if that's fair. But I totally agree that the next step is to say, well, okay, so then how do you choose your goals and what are the multiple factors that contribute to that? And Gaia actually just wrote a text paper on this very topic, where the first half is kind of what I presented here, like, okay, goals matter for reinforcement learning, but the second half is like, okay, so then like, how do we choose your goals? And that's actually very broad literature in particular in social psychology, where people have explored that in many aspects. many, factors are known to play a role there. Likely some of them are, recurrent in the sense that you might be choosing goals in a way that's value dependent, which might create very interesting loops potentially from, you select a goal because it's valuable, but then it carries value in itself and reinforces other things, which could, lead to potentially very interesting phenomena there. I'm rambling.
Like, in response to my
Yeah.
question, you could argue that's even your testament
Yeah.
is even more conservative because
Yeah.
after you find the effects,
Absolutely.
are meaningless is even like
Exactly. Yeah.
you find that.
Absolutely. No, that's
It's even more powerful than
that's exactly what we were going for. Yeah, it's trying to remove all things. But I agree that the question of how people choose goals becomes even more important once you know that goals, have their own like real added value, because because then it's going to impact everything down the line, right? Yeah. Thank you. Any other questions?
I'll ask one of them.
Yeah.
Yes, so, if we go back to the earlier experiments, it seems like when people are choosing something, you could explain the voluntary like findings and the findings that if you achieve your goal, then that's who you're supposed to be.
Yeah.
And so you're saying that that's not a dumb RL process when you're using your goals too much.
Yeah. Yeah.
So you could also flip it on its head and say, in those test cases later on, why don't they have the goal of achieving what they know the outcome should have been?
Yeah.
Therefore, why don't they choose actually the high value option in that case? And a very quick follow-up is that in your own work on working memory and reinforcement learning, you know that when you are solving something
Yeah.
with working memory, actually preventing your RL system from learning the correct strategy
Yeah.
later on also doesn't really seem so normative. I just wonder whether
Yeah. So for the first question, I think that goes back to the question of what is people's goals, right? We said it very simplistically in this task of saying like pick the, like the best of the potential outcomes. It's likely that people have more complex goals than that. But I think, the fact is that in the test phases, in some of those test phases, they don't see outcomes anymore, right? So they don't observe what their outcome is. So it's very possible that their goals are, in a sense, simple enough that they are, they're not that complex as like going back through computing everything and trying to get, the highest outcome, especially when it's not below their nose. But in some cases, like there's a version of the experiment that Bavard and Parmentier did where they get complete feedback during the test phase. So they do see their outcomes there. In case 8, for example, they see the outcome of what they got and what they, the counterfactual to. And you see that this is the case where the effect is weakest. Actually, in average, it's overchains here. And if you plot it as a learning curve, it goes up. So people do, like follow that simple goal in that case, and you can plot the learning curve and see it, like emerge in that way. And the models capture that too. So I think it does go back to the question of like, what are goals really, and how do we set them? And we had a, like a proof of principle kind of like, let's just say goals is try to get the best thing. It kind of works in this case, but certainly in real life, it's going to be more complex than that. And with very interesting potential individual differences too. Yeah. The second question,
we can probably just talk about that.
yeah,
later.
sounds good. Sounds good. Yeah.
Any other questions?
Yeah.
Do you have any direct evidence that the learning that you get from goals is in fact cash value, like the art and the value and stuff like that?
Yeah, so I don't have direct evidence for it, right? I don't know what form direct evidence would take, but
Like when you change the context, that they still tend to behave that way.
yeah, so we could talk about habits, and I don't really necessarily buy the habit as cash value kind of thing. But I think, going for what I'm saying is multiple things. One, the fact that they do have a transfer phase, right, where like they're in a different context and express, you know, their preferences in a way that's consistent with cache values. The fact that, you know, the best contender, I think, for another process is this planning-like process where you know, you take this task here, for example, and you say that in the goal condition, people don't learn cache values. Instead, they learn transition probabilities between, you know, the square and the category of images that is labeled as goals. And then when they see, you know, this, they form a plan to try to pick the item that leads to the goal category of image, right? That would be the, you know, like goal-directed kind of model-based interpretation for this. I think there's a very clear, you know, prediction out of that is that one, the reaction times should be slower. Two, it should really leverage different processes in the brain at the time of choice. We actually have no difference between conditions at the time of choice in the scanner, and the reaction times are the same. So, you know, I'm not ruling it out, but it's not the most consistent kind of
I think that the thing I'm thinking about is the word cache.
Yeah.
What is cache?
Yeah.
What does it mean to be cache?
Yeah.
If it's something you can change on the fly.
Well, it's the reward value that's changing the fly, right? Now the value, and that's kind of the whole point, right? It's like you're going to set the reward value on the fly, and it's going to become integrated into the cache value, not of the fractal, right? Of the star.
Yeah, I agree.
Right.
So what I'm trying to ask is whether
Yeah.
that value is in fact cache. What would be evidence that is cache?
Yeah, and I think our strongest evidence is from the imaging.
Right.
Yeah. But I agree that it's not, you know, like it's not a smoking gun by any means, right? Like, and I don't know what a smoking gun would be either. So yeah, I think it's like this converging evidence that's the best explanation so far. But yeah.
Okay, let's thank Ken.